So we got a Husqvarna 353 here, and the issue is that it just won't start. So I want to get at the carburetor and everything else, so I'm going to be using just a standard screwdriver, and I'm just going to pop that clip, and then we can pull off this top shroud, have a look at what's going on. So once I got that cover off, I just pulled the spark plug here using a 3/4 inch socket, and this one's an NGK BPMR7A, so it's a 7-range plug. Doesn't look all that terrible. It actually looks pretty good. I'm just checking for spark now, so with the plug pulled, there's no compression. Give it a few pulls with my spark tester here, and it does have spark. So kill switch off. We got spark. Kill switch on, should have no spark. Now that I know it has spark, the next thing to do is most likely pull the air filter and then pull the carburetor, and it's probably just a diaphragm that's hardened up and is not pumping fuel. So just pulling this little tab back, the air box pops right off. We can see here our throttle line connects from this handle here, goes through here, around here to that up there. So looks like this carburetor is just held on by these little rubber tabs here and down here, so we can pop that right off. But before I do that, I'm going to disconnect the fuel line here, because that comes from the fuel tank up into the carburetor. And once you have those little tabs out, you can pull your carburetor up just far enough just to get at our Allen bolts here, and those bolts go back to the intake manifold right here. So we'll be able to pull our carburetor up even further once we have those bolts off, and then we could go ahead and remove our carburetor throttle linkage. So once we have our bolts off using just a Torx screwdriver, now everything's kind of loose, you guys can see here. So there's a primary air box here, then you have your carburetor, then we have another plastic piece here that goes back to the intake manifold. They make it fairly simple to remove the throttle cable though. Instead of a hole, there's just this slot here, and there's just this little spring holding it on. So all you got to do is pull this spring back, and then you can go ahead and lift your throttle linkage directly out of the throttle arm there. So what I'm going to do now is disconnect our kill wire, and then I'll be able to pull the carburetor and the air box up together as one piece. And to disconnect our little kill wire here, you're just going to pull on that tab, and then there's going to be one back here. You're going to pull back on that one as well, and that will completely disconnect our wire. And like I said, once that kill wire is off, we should just be able to pull this entire assembly out as one piece. Now I can go ahead and start getting this cleaned up. So this is what we're left with here. We can see there's quite a bit of grease and whatnot in there. However, I should note that this carburetor does not have a return line design into it, so from what I can tell, there's only this one fuel line here, and I'm assuming that is directly from the fuel tank into the carburetor, and there is no return line because this one doesn't have a primer on it, which then forces the fuel through it, and then the fuel from this line would circulate through the carburetor and then back through the return line into the tank, and it just kind of keeps recirculating fuel. Whereas on this model, it just has a choke, so you pull the choke, which creates more suction. Because the choke butterfly valve is closed, it then draws more fuel through and less air, so that kind of helps start your machine. Now from what I can tell, there's two different types of carburetors that they run on these Husqvarna 353s. There's going to be a C3 EL17 and a C3 EL18, and this one looks like to be the EL18 because it has this white piece of plastic around the jets. Now the way you get this choke lever off is you basically just come over here to the little plastic piece, and you're just going to pinch that with a pair of needle nose pliers, and you should be able to pull it right out. So now that we have the air box separated from the carb, I can go ahead and start cleaning that into my ultrasonic cleaner. I got the air box cleaned out in my ultrasonic cleaner, and I just blew it out with my compressor. The front little plastic piece there with the choke and whatnot, I got that all cleaned up. Okay, so I've drained out the fuel, and what I've done here is just using a pair of needle nose pliers. You go in, you grab the fuel line, you pull out your fuel filter, because I'm going to replace this fuel filter. The fuel line looks like it's in excellent condition, so I don't have to change that. I've inspected it up here as well as down there. So what I'm going to do is just pull the fuel filter off, and then I'll hook up my compressor to one end, and I'll just blow it out, and I'll also put my finger at the other end just to see if it holds a little bit of pressure, and that'll let me know if there is a little crack in the fuel line somewhere. And if it does hold some pressure, then I'll just go ahead and replace that fuel filter. So I blew out the line, got my new fuel filter. That's going to go back inside the tank, and when you put that in there, you just want to make sure that it is sitting at the bottom of the tank. So on the left here, I have the old carburetor that I pulled off of this machine, and on the right, I have a brand new STENS 616-400, and that is a Zama C3-EL18 carburetor. Not compatible with more than 10% ethanol fuel, so you don't want to be running more than E10. So I'm going to be installing this new carburetor onto our chainsaw, and we're going to fire it up and see how it runs. So the first thing I'm going to be doing to this carburetor is we're going to drop that in. I'm going to hook up the throttle linkage. So again, coming back to this little spring, we're going to lift that little spring off, slide our throttle linkage in, and then put that spring over top of our throttle linkage to make sure it locks it into place. And then we'll go ahead and hook up our fuel line last. Now, if you want to remove these little limiter caps, you just take a pair of needle nose pliers and just pry up on them. They just sit right on top of the high and low idle speed, and then you'll be able to remove them all together so that you can blast some cleaner down in there. But if you're going to take them out, I would recommend screwing them all the way in and counting the amount of turns it goes in, and then you'll know your factory setting. Now, normally they do have a spline on them, or they'll be like a D or a Pac-Man type design. This one does have the splines on it, but we can see here that it also has a groove, so you can go in there with a small standard flathead screwdriver and make your adjustments there. Now, the easiest way to install our throttle cable here is you're going to come in underneath your choke lever there, over top of your fuel line, and we're just going to pop it into position first. We'll worry about getting our spring retainer on there after, and you can do your little choke plastic piece once you have the throttle cable positioned. Now, having a pair of small needle nose pliers really makes this job a lot easier because it allows you to go in there and bend that little spring around the throttle linkage there, and then you're just going to go ahead and give your throttle a pull and make sure that it works perfectly and nothing pops out, which we can see it does. So now I'm going to go ahead and pop our little choke lever on with that plastic piece. We can go ahead and hook up the fuel line, and then go ahead and get our 2 bolts here and bolt this carburetor back onto the machine. Now, I should note that inside of here, that's called the bellows. A lot of times people are going to call it the intake manifold, and Husqvarna ended up making these out of plastic instead of steel like they used to, so these are prone to splitting and cracking, so you should have a little inspection of that. From what I can see, this looks like it's in non-damaged condition, so it doesn't look like it is cracked, but I just wanted to let you guys know so that you can have an inspection of yours before you go ahead and put your carb on. Now, the next step here is going to be to take your blue choke lever and pop it into the choke lever at the bottom, that little hole. And what you're going to do before you do that is make sure when you come across with this little black piece here, you're going to want to make sure that your black piece here that goes into the little rubber grommet is going to be underneath your throttle cable. I've also gone ahead and hooked up my fuel line. So now the only thing I have left to do is bolt the carburetor and this little air box to the bellows. So all you're going to do is lift up on this whole assembly, and you'll be able to slide your 2 bolts in there. Use a Torx screwdriver to screw these little bolts in here. So I got them tightened. Just make sure that you don't tighten them up too much, because again, if you have the newer style Husqvarna, the bellows is going to be made out of plastic instead of steel. So if you over tighten your fasteners, you might end up stripping something. So we're going to go ahead and hook up my kill switch, and then we'll pop the carburetor back into those rubber grommets. So I have my kill switch reconnected here, and now would be a good time to remove your spark plug and just go ahead and check your kill switch operation. Make sure that it works. Make sure that there's no spark when the kill switch is on and that there is spark when the kill switch is off. But now we're ready to push the carburetor back into these little rubber grommets, and I find that it's easier to go in on the right side and then use a flathead screwdriver, a little standard small screwdriver, and you're going to pry that rubber grommet back. We're going to drop that little plastic pin down, and we're going to pop the rubber grommet over top of it. And now that you have everything hooked up, go ahead, move your throttle cable, come down here, move your choke, make sure that that is fully operational. So we can see that's working as it's supposed to. So I'm going to go ahead and put the air filter back onto this machine, and we're going to take it outside, fire it up. Okay, so I got the chainsaw here, and the way that you start this is you're going to pull the choke out first, and you're going to come around. We have the decompression valve right here on this model. We're going to push it in. I'm going to start it, and it's going to fire and die. Then we're going to push the choke in. We're going to push the decompression valve in again, and we're going to go ahead and start it. But it's going to be in a stage called high idle, so we're going to have to press the throttle to lower the idle speed down. Okay, so we can tell that the idle is slightly too low, and I'm going to have to lean out the low idle screw. Now, it might be hard to see, but you see that little L right on the carburetor there? So that stands for low idle speed. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just going to turn in this white screw here, and I did leave the safety caps on it so that nobody can really mess with it too far. So all I'm going to do is screw that in slightly to lean the mixture out, and it should raise the revs a bit. So I got the chainsaw idling outside. You could probably hear it. So this is your idle adjustment screw. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn that out slightly, and it should lower that idle. Oh, that thing runs mint now with that new carburetor. So the reason that you adjust the idle when the blade brake or the chain brake is off is so that you can adjust the centrifugal clutch. Now the way a centrifugal clutch works is there's these pads, they're almost like brake pads, and they run on springs. So as your flywheel spins faster, those pads end up getting pushed outwards due to centrifugal force, and they grab a drum, and then that runs your chain. So basically, if your RPM is too high, as soon as you take your brake off, your chain's going to start to roll, and that's what you guys saw. So then you just turn your idle down ever so slightly until the chain stops rolling, and that's it. You're good to go. You can put the brake back on, put the chain cover back on, and this is ready to go back to my customer. So with the new carburetor installed on that chainsaw, man, does it ever run nice now. Nice and smooth, the idle's good, and like I said, you're just going to take that brake off, and you're going to set your idle with the chain running so that when it stops, you'll know that your centrifugal clutch is not engaging. If you guys enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. You can click here to subscribe and click the EPV button to check out EP Vlogs, my second channel where I upload a little bit of extra content. Also, click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to stop on by next week to check the channel out for new content. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.